Leslie Sullivan. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County and the Women's Equality Coalition. Tonight marks the closing event of the 2025 Women's Equality Week. This annual observance was launched in 2012 by community activists Alice Kitchen and Gail James, who united women's organizations to honor August 26th, the date in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified and became part of the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. The member organizations of the Women's Equality Coalition continue this mission by collaborating to eliminate discrimination against women and promote opportunities for women's advancement. This evening, it is our great honor to welcome Dianna Wynn, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Elected in 2024, Ms. Wynn has long been recognized as a steadfast champion of democracy, civic engagement, and equal rights. Her leadership has been especially impactful in addressing gerrymandering and redistricting, working to ensure that electoral systems remain fair and inclusive, protecting the voices of all communities. She has also been a strong advocate for advancing CEDAW, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, encouraging its adoption at the local level to strengthen gender equity and human rights in community governance. With more than 3 decades of experience as a civic leader, educator, and advocate, Ms. Wynn brings exceptional skill and commitment to her role. Under her leadership, the League of Women Voters continues to stand at the forefront of defending democracy and advancing equality. Please join me in welcoming Dianna Wynn. And we have a proclamation from both the Kansas City League, Mayor Quentin Lucas, and also the Johnson County Commissioners. We have proclamations for Dianna and Women's Equality Week and League of Women Voters. So, Karen.
Good evening. Good evening, Dianna. I'm Harry Bognich. I am current president of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, Kansas. And I am very pleased to have you accept this proclamation, which came from Mike Kelly, the chairman of the Johnson County Board of County Commissioners in Johnson County, Kansas. And it is a proclamation honoring Women's Equality Week and the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, Kansas.
Thank you.
Well, that's good. It's gotta be able to take a picture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Dianna, I'm Melanie Bussey, for those that don't know me, and I'm the president of the Kansas City League of Women Voters, Jackson, Clay, Platte counties, and Cass County and Lafayette County. I have a proclamation from Mayor Clinton Lucas from Kansas City, Missouri, again in honor of Women's Equality Week and your work for the women voters. Thank you so much. This is.
Wow. Wow. Johnson County's got to get their act together.
Just for pics. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. That was really something. It is such a pleasure to be here in Kansas and Missouri. It is not often that I get to speak to a group of people, especially a lot of league members from 2 states at the same time. So it is just a pleasure to be here. Now, last month,
I was in Rochester, New York. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to tour the home of Susan B. Anthony.
Oh, wow.
And then after that, I paid a visit to the gravesite of Frederick Douglass. Now, of course, Anthony and Douglass were very close friends. Both of them were suffragists. But it was a poignant reminder to me that day that the fight for equality and the work to secure voting rights has been long and hard fought. So today, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the women's suffrage movement that resulted in the 19th Amendment, and specifically about women's participation in our elections since gaining the right to vote. I'm also going to talk about some additional advances toward gender equity, as well as persistent inequality. So heads up, I have both good news and bad news about the status of women in the United States. And then finally, I want to share a few thoughts with you about women's powerful influence in advancing democracy. So, as many of you know, the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And during this convention, a number of resolutions were debated. Now, some of you may be surprised to learn that the most hotly contested of all of the proposed resolutions at that convention was women's right to vote. With some people at the convention saying it was just too radical. Others saying it was simply outside the scope of the convention. However, Frederick Douglass, the only Black person at the convention, because quite frankly, women of color had been intentionally excluded. But Douglass, he stood and he spoke persuasively in favor of women's suffrage. And the women's suffrage resolution at Seneca Falls then passed by a large majority. However, as I think many of you know, resistance to women's voting rights across much of the nation was fierce. It was fierce. Suffragist demands were often met with derision, ridicule, and dismissiveness. But isn't that how people in power have often responded when women demand equal rights, right? I would also suggest that that level of resistance is also a recognition of the power of voting, right? So it wasn't until 72 years later in 1920 that the 19th Amendment would be ratified by 36 states and enacted into law. And the people of Missouri and Kansas should be proud, because Missouri ratified it only a month after Congress approved it, and Kansas ratified the amendment only 6 days after it passed Congress. Of course, yeah. Of course, Kansas had already granted women the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. And the amendment was ratified in August of 1920, and August 26th is now designated Women's Equality Day, which was just a couple days ago this week. But the amendment very nearly failed to pass in 1920 and was ratified by that 36th state by only one vote. And many of you may be familiar with the story. Harry Byrne, a Tennessee legislator, he had initially intended to vote for the amendment, but after being pressured by party leaders, he was going to vote against it. But then a letter from his mother was instrumental in changing his mind in favor of the amendment. And Harry Byrne has been quoted as saying, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." And that's very sweet. But what he also later said was, "I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine." So Harry Byrne is rightfully lauded for casting that one vote that ratified the 19th Amendment. But in the history of women's suffrage, let's not forget his mother's
Amen.
name.
Yeah.
Phoebe or Feb Byrne, right? Let's also not forget the power of one
Letter.
vote. But the reality is that the 19th Amendment primarily benefited white women. Most women of color didn't truly gain access to the ballot in 1920 as a result of voter suppression laws and intimidation tactics, the same barriers that men of color were facing. So it wasn't until 60 years ago, also in August of 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that the promise of the 19th Amendment began to be fulfilled for all women. So in this month of August, if we are to truly acknowledge the history of women's suffrage, then as we commemorate Women's Equality Day, let's also celebrate the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
Mhm.
Now, as many of you know, in 1920, the same year that the 19th Amendment was passed, the League of Women Voters was founded. And when the 19th Amendment passed, 26 million women became eligible to vote that year. And in 1920, there was a presidential election. So it was a big year. So the newly founded League of Women Voters went to work, running a Get Out the Vote campaign and providing nonpartisan information about how government works and how elections work for women to prepare them for their first election. And of course, 105 years later, voter education and turnout continue to be a key part of the League's work. So today, our mission at the League is twofold: empower voters and defend democracy. But I particularly like the League's value statement, which reads, "We believe in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy." And women are certainly doing their part as voters. Now, in the 1920 presidential election, voter turnout among women is estimated at somewhere between 35 to 45%, compared to men's turnout that election at 68%. Now, given that women, and remember mostly white women at the time, had gained the right to vote less than 10 weeks earlier, only 69 days prior to the election day, I don't think this was a poor turnout on the part of women in 1920. But since then, women's voting rates have significantly improved, and women in the US have long voted at higher rates than men. Nationally, more women than men are registered to vote. The number of women registered to vote typically exceeds men by about 10 million voters, though in 2024, the gender gap was about 8.7 million. So we'll see how that develops over the years. In presidential elections, the proportion of eligible women turning out to vote has exceeded the proportion of eligible men turning out to vote since 1980. And in every presidential election since 1964, the total number of women voters has exceeded the total number of men voting since 1964. A Pew Research survey asked people what the most important turning point was for advancing the position of women in the United States. And women's suffrage was the most often cited milestone. But despite women's tendency to outpace men in voting, women remain underrepresented in elected office. And I want to share some statistics with you. At the federal level, in the US Senate, only 26% of seats are held by women. In the US House, less than 29% of seats are held by women. And of course, we've yet to have a woman for president. At the state level, only 12 of our 50 states have a woman for governor. One of those 12 women is the governor of Kansas. Lieutenant governors fare better, with 22 out of 43 currently being women, so that's about 51%. But in state senates, only about 30% are women, and on the House side of state legislatures, less than 35% are women. And specifically, in Missouri and Kansas, about 29% of Missouri state legislature are women, and about 33% of Kansas's legislature are women. So tracking with, in general, the national average. Now, at the local level, if we look across the nation, of all the mayors in cities with a population of over 30,000, only 25% are women. In our 100 largest cities, only 36 have a woman for their mayor. Keep in mind that females comprise about 51% of the entire population. So as you can see, women are significantly underrepresented in government. But certainly, we've also made great strides for gender equity. And I'm going to share just a few milestones in my lifetime. So you're gonna kind of be able to guess how old I am. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed, and it required that employers pay equal wages for the same work regardless of gender. And then many decades later, in 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act made it easier to file claims demonstrating sex discrimination in pay. Yet we know pay inequity still exists, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. In 1971, the practice of employers refusing to hire women with preschool children, that was outlawed. In 1972, the passage of Title IX banned sex discrimination in programs that received federal funds, including nearly all educational institutions. And this had a monumental impact on the growth of women's sports. In 1973, a Supreme Court ruling upheld a ban on sex segregated help wanted ads. Now, as a little girl, I remember my mother looking for jobs in the female section of the newspaper want ads, so no more. In 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act banned banks from requiring that single, widowed, and divorced women bring a man along to co-sign credit applications. So women could finally get credit cards in their own name, regardless of marital status. Now, my mom was a working woman by then. She would have before then had to have someone co-sign for a credit card. Now, after women gained the right to vote in 1920, only 18 states allowed women on juries. Only 18.
Wow.
Now, some of you, this is my favorite movie, but some of you may recall the classic 1957 film starring Henry Fonda. Well, that film was called 12 Angry Men for a reason. But in 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that women could no longer be systematically excluded from juries. In 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act banned employment discrimination based on pregnancy or childbirth. And in 2013, the US military removed its ban on women serving in combat positions, which of course opened them up to greater career advancement. And, you know, we could go on and on about all of the advances in gender equity, and these are just a few of the many advances. Since the passage of the 19th Amendment over a century ago, overall, women have made significant progress in most aspects of life. Yet despite gains for women's rights, inequities still persist. The World Economic Forum analyzed 148 countries in terms of gender parity, and the US ranks 42nd. It ranks 42nd in terms of gender parity. On average, working women in the US are typically paid just 75 cents for every dollar a man earns, and the wage gap is much wider for women of color. Black women make only 64 cents, Native American women only 52 cents, and Latino women only 51 cents for every dollar a man earns. And even though women surpass men in earning college degrees these days, we continue to be underrepresented within the highest paying careers. For example, in Fortune 500 companies, only 11% are currently led by women CEOs, and only 2 of those are Black women. And on top of it all, that weren't enough. On top of it all, women continue to bear more of the burden of unpaid childcare and household work. So as a result, women just simply have less free time. We are making progress in the gender pay gap. But at the rate we're going, women will not achieve pay equity with men until the year 2088. Doesn't mean we can't change that, right? About mobilization, and the timeline is considerably longer for women of color. Nevertheless, as I stand here today, I have more rights and greater opportunity than my mother or my grandmothers ever had. Since 1920, women have made tremendous strides toward gender equality, but of course, there is still much work to do, which is why we need organizations like the League of Women Voters and the Women's Equality Coalition, right? And in talking about historic milestones and women's rights, I must mention what should be another celebrated landmark in women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment. I get angry when I start talking about it, sorry. The ERA was ratified. It was ratified 5 years ago, but it is yet to be officially added to our Constitution. And you know, about 8 in 10 adults, including majorities of men and women, Republicans and Democrats, favor adding the ERA to the US Constitution. Now, it was ratified 5 years ago. And last year, the American Bar Association adopted a resolution acknowledging the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment and urging its constitutional implementation. The League of Women Voters has been a long-time supporter of the ERA, and we will continue to work along with coalition partners for its full implementation in this country. As we celebrate women's voting rights this month, I must warn you that that fight is not over. 105 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, 60 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, our voting rights are at risk. Legislation has been introduced into Congress that could further disenfranchise voters, in particular women. The SAVE Act purports to prevent non-citizens from voting, something that is exceedingly rare. What the SAVE Act really does is make it harder to register to vote, especially for women. And how does it do this? It requires very specific documentation when registering to prove your citizenship. So if the SAVE Act were passed, you would need a government-issued photo ID that shows your place of birth, like a passport. But at least half of Americans don't have a passport. So instead, most people would use their driver's license as their photo ID. My driver's license doesn't include my place of birth. So under the SAVE Act, along with that photo ID, the SAVE Act would require that I produce a second form of documentation along with that photo ID that shows where I was born, like a birth certificate. Problem is, Your name must match exactly across your documents. About 69 million women who have changed their name when they married or for other reasons would find it very difficult to register to vote. And people of color under this act are 3 times more likely not to have the required documents readily available. This is a piece of voter suppression legislation. So we continue to ask voters to tell Congress to vote no on the SAVE Act. And remember, I said earlier that voting rights weren't truly extended to women of color by the 19th Amendment in 1920. That only happened with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. However, in 2013, the US Supreme Court handed down a decision that effectively gutted key components of the Voting Rights Act. And since that court decision, a report by the US Commission on Civil Rights found an increase in laws that make it harder to vote, especially for minority populations. But Congress has the power to correct the gaps created by the Supreme Court. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act represents our best defense against voter suppression practices. This bill aims to rectify that disastrous Supreme Court decision by modernizing and strengthening the Voting Rights Act. Now, I know you all care deeply about women's rights and women's voting rights, including the rights of women of color. So I ask you to continue to call on Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about the essential role of women in the preservation of our democracy. Fact is that women are at the forefront in the defense of democracy. I want to share some research with you. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace published a report last year. And in that report, they observed that there has been an erosion in old and new democracies in every region of the world, including in the United States. But I think that you all are probably well aware of this. However, the report also noted that women have historically been at the forefront of pro-democracy movements, and specifically that women are driving pro-democratic mobilization as grassroots activists in the United States right now. And I think I'm looking at a room full of them. I'd like to also share with you some of the research of Harvard political scientist Dr. Erica Chenoweth, who analyzed hundreds of 20th century violent revolutions and nonviolent campaigns worldwide. So 100 years of analyzing revolutions and campaigns globally. Their research revealed that it is vital to have women involved, including in leadership positions. This is what the research tells us. It is vital to have women involved for any civil resistance campaign to be successful. The research pointed out, since World War II, very few movements across the world that excluded women have been effective. Why? The research suggests largely because the inclusion of women provides greater opportunity for tactical innovation. Right? Yeah. Now, Chenoweth's research also revealed that to achieve sweeping change in a nation or to prevent an authoritarian takeover requires only about 3.5% of the population engaging in nonviolent, collective grassroots action. And women make up more than 3.5% of the population. But we must mobilize, and we must mobilize in a unified and a coordinated way. And I think that we are and can do that. So I have reason to be hopeful, both for the future of women's rights and the future of our democracy. You know, we must make the connection between the suffrage and women's movements and the moment that we find ourselves in today. From Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, the many advances in rights and opportunities for women and girls in this nation are largely due to the efforts and the sacrifices courageous and outspoken women's rights activists. So our charge today is to preserve their legacy and work toward a more just and equitable America, regardless of gender. You know, the founding of the League of Women Voters is very much rooted in the suffrage movement. And we continue to believe in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. I want to thank you all for including me here and celebrate the power of women. Thank you. Now, we have men in the room too, and I love men, but you know, this week we're celebrating women.
If anybody would like to ask Dianna a question, please come up to the podium. I think we have some index cards back there too, if you're too shy to come up here, but we would like to have it on the Zoom.
Well, if they raise their hand, I can repeat the question.
Oh, that'd be
If you're
fine.
on
You
Zoom,
wanna-
how's
Okay,
that?
go for it.
I have a question from the Zoom room. Has the ERA really been ratified? Didn't the original deadlines expire? And is that the reason it hasn't been implemented?
Okay, I'm not an attorney, so I want to preface it this way. I'm also going to point to the American Bar Association, that is the premier professional association for attorneys. They passed that resolution, recognizing that it is in fact been ratified. Now, constitutional scholars have looked at this, and you know, you could have them give a whole presentation on this supposed deadline. And I'm gonna say two things, but there are probably some people in the room that are, you know, understand, well, I understand it, but might be able to speak more eloquently to it. But I'll just make 2 points. One, it has repeatedly been pointed out that that deadline is not actually part of the language of the amendment, and that matters from a legal standpoint. And secondly, Constitution says nothing about a deadline for passing a constitutional amendment. And before the ERA, which amendment was it? I always forget the number. It took a couple hundred years before that amendment was ratified. I think it had to do with pay raises for Congress. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that correct? That's my recollection. So yes, there's been debate about the legality of the deadline and whether it truly was a deadline or one that is legally enforceable. But again, I'm gonna lean on the American Bar Association. And I think that that gives you the answer. It is ratified. I would also point out, before leaving office, you know, I wish that President Biden had directed the archivist to actually publish the ERA. I think he should have done that. But before leaving office, he put out a statement also recognizing that the ERA had been ratified. Now, the work is not over. I mean, I think a lot of this is it's going toward litigation, and the ERA coalition will continue to figure out what the strategy is going forward to get the ERA not ratified, it's ratified, but recognized.
Right. Could you say a little bit more about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the status? I mean, I know I've heard 100 things about it, but where is it and who should we be advocating?
Okay, so the question is, you know, could I say a little bit more about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act? So I mentioned that in 2013, that's the case of Shelby v. Holder, the US Supreme Court handed down a decision. It really gutted key components. The original Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, just to give you some history. It was revised, amended and passed 5 times by a bipartisan vote over the years. So the fact that this hasn't been passed is really not the norm. In the original Voting Rights Act, there were pre-clearance requirements. So states that had a history of voter suppression, before they could change their voting laws, they had to get federal approval. So they had to go through the Department of Justice in order to make sure that their changes to their voting laws were not going to disenfranchise people of color. Well, the Supreme Court, in their ruling, essentially made that unenforceable, made it unenforceable. There have been some additional rulings since then that have further weakened the Voting Rights Act, including the ability of individuals and groups to actually bring a case forward. And again, I'm not an attorney, so, and it gets into some minutia. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act will address the Supreme Court's concerns. So new legislation can address the concerns that were expressed in their decisions in order to put the Voting Rights Act again in fully enforced. So instead of naming certain states that require pre-clearance, it would be based on the nature of their population. If it's a highly diverse population, then, before you change voting laws in a state, that needs to be examined. It would do things like that. But again, because we're fighting a Congress where the majority is wanting to advance voter suppression legislation, we haven't gotten the votes yet for a piece of legislation that is sorely needed in order to advance voter protections. Now, the current Congress, I'm not confident will pass this, but, and I always, when people, kind of, well, why should we bother? Well, tell that to the suffragists that worked for 72 years to get the right to vote. You don't give up on an issue just because you're not going to win the fight tomorrow. There are battles along the way where you chip away at it. And, when we have the right votes, or the opportunity, we have to have been doing the work all along. And you certainly need to be talking to the public about the importance of voter protection. So call your senator, call your rep in Congress. And don't just call them once, call them over and over and over again. Before the session started, I was with a group of many of you. Really, we should be flooding their phone lines, clogging their email. Don't vote for the SAVE Act. Do vote for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Tell them what we want.
From the Zoom room, someone wants to know, where do things stand with the SAVE Act? Is it going to come up for a vote?
Okay, some people have said, well, I thought it was dead. Do not ever send that to me. This was introduced in the last Congress. And the league and other organizations pointed out how this would harm, it not just women, but certainly women specifically. But do you think that they revised it to correct that in the new Congress? So they know full well what the impact would be. And I want you to let that sink in. So when I say 105 years after the 19th Amendment was passed, our voting rights at risk, I say that in all seriousness. So I believe we still needed to go to, it still needed to go to a vote in the Senate. And it's just been stalled. However, I got a notice just a few days ago that the Tea Party is planning a national tour. And one of the issues that they are platforming or highlighting is the SAVE Act. So this is not a dead issue. The moment where they think they can get the votes to pass it, that's when it will happen. You cannot let up on the pressure on this. Don't assume that this is a dead issue. I absolutely do not. Let me take this question. How do we encourage nonpartisanship in this political climate? Well, that's a hard question to answer because, well, I mean, in all seriousness, our political system is based on two parties. Parties are partisan, right? That's the way it is. And most of you are probably partisan in some way. And even if you're involved in the league, you just separate that work and that ideology, and do your work in a nonpartisan way in the league. So I don't necessarily advocate that everyone be strictly nonpartisan. Our system is not built that way politically. Instead, I would say what we need is civil discourse that is based on facts. Yeah, right? Well, understand, even if you agree on the facts, you may come to different conclusions on the same facts, but that's okay, right? That's always been the case. We can reason to different conclusions, but right now, we have a crisis in disinformation, where we can't even agree on what is truth, what is a basic fact, as if that is negotiable. So I think the most important thing that we need to do is continue as an organization, for those of you who are working within the league or within another organization, continue to put out accurate information, continue to correct mis and disinformation. And I will also tell you, like the league, if you work in a nonpartisan way, when you correct information that is not factual, I think that you're more credible. You know, when you're coming from a nonpartisan stance and you're correcting the facts, that's a more credible voice. So I hope that helps to get at the answer to the question. Yeah. Oh, wait a minute, I had a question over here first.
So redistricting is in the news now, and can you speak to the league's position on gerrymandering?
Sure. So, the league has had a long-standing position against gerrymandering, for decades. For decades, we've been involved in court cases. I know in North Carolina, it's been at least 35 years, so it depends on the state. In 2016, we formalized our position and the members adopted, an anti-gerrymandering position, and those in the league can go to Impact on Issues, and you can read that position. So we oppose gerrymandering. We oppose partisan gerrymandering. We don't think that's fair. We oppose racial gerrymandering. But you're asking, I think, really about the moment we're in now with gerrymandering, right? So redistricting has to happen, right? Redistricting is a good thing because that's a response to growth and changes in population. So you need to redraw your districts, and we do that after the census every 10 years. Gerrymandering is related to redistricting, but it is a manipulation of the redrawing of those maps in order to favor a political party, sometimes an individual politician, or to disenfranchise some populations. So we oppose gerrymandering. Well, we're in 2025. Next census isn't until 2030. We should not be doing mid-cycle redistricting for the purpose of gerrymandering. Now, mid-cycle redistricting happens often as a result of a court order in order to correct a gerrymander, and in some other rare circumstances. But now we have what I'm calling metaphorically a gerrymandering arms race. Texas has said, and they've gone through with it, that they were going to draw maps to favor the Republican Party at the behest of the president. California responded by saying, well, they will counteract that to draw districts to favor probably the Democratic Party. And now other states are saying they're going to join in that. I believe also Missouri may be in that mix. We oppose gerrymandering and mid-cycle redistricting. But we also recognize it's happening. It's happening. So what is the league's role now at this moment going forward? It's what it always is, when redistricting happens after a census. What we ask is for the league and for voters, whether you're a member of the league or not, to be engaged in this issue. Demand from your legislature that there is a transparent process and that there is public input and that you know how these maps are going to be drawn and that they're going to be fair. So you need to make some demands as voters. The league in particular will be monitoring the resulting maps to see if they disenfranchise, especially Black and brown voters. So 2 days ago, we put out guidance to governors and redistricting bodies with some criteria, some things that they need to not do. If there is a majority-minority district, it needs to remain intact. Don't eliminate a majority-minority district and don't disenfranchise Black and brown voters in other ways in the process of redistricting. Don't dilute the votes of young people by dividing a college or university community, right? So we're going to be looking at, those kinds of issues. Don't divide up, tribal communities and dilute the votes of Native Americans. In looking at communities of interest, don't fold in, major agricultural centers with other areas that don't share those same interests. So there are a number of issues we need to be looking at to make sure the people are really represented in the resulting maps. And what we are telling governors is that we're gonna monitor this. And if we see they are disenfranchising or harming these communities, we will respond in every community in those states with the full force of the league, including going to court if we need to do that. So that's our position. And I want to make clear that is a nonpartisan position. So you're all clear. This is not a position that's any different than what we've ever had, except that we can't stop this process that shouldn't be happening in the first place.
Thank you.
I think that you had one.
They had the same question.
Okay.
So moving forward to the next census, I know there's the intent to change the way they do the census and not count every person in the country. And so I was wondering if the league is looking at that,
Yes.
because again, that would affect representation.
So, I've been deeply involved in redistricting before I joined the national board and became president. I live in North Carolina, one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation. So this is something that is very near to me. I have been redistricted, gerrymandered repeatedly over the years, and including recently. Work on redistricting does not start in 2031 after the census. That's not when we start working on this issue. We start working on it with the census, demanding a full count of the people, a full count. And, this is required by the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say citizens, right? It doesn't say that. So what you can expect, I don't know if the litigation would come from the league, because there may be a different coalition that's more appropriate, or we may be involved in it. But, of course, we're a voice in that process. What she's speaking to is a plan to not count non-citizens who live in this nation. We need a full count of all the people. So we will continue to advocate on behalf of non-citizen immigrants. Again, I don't think that that complies with the Constitution. So, I mean, there's some litigation that may be coming down the line. So in redistricting, you start with advocating for a full count. That, by the way, includes demanding it be fully funded, that that process be fully funded. So I encourage you, if you have the opportunity to be engaged in the census process, either working it or advocating for it within your state, to do so. And also then advocating before 2031 for a fair redistricting process within your legislatures. So lining that up in plenty of time. Mhm.
So it's all very fine to say that we would like to count everyone, but what can we do to make it possible for people who are in this country to fill out a census form without signing their life away
Yeah.
in this present environment?
I can't answer that question. I think that that is a question that will be best answered by immigration rights organizations in terms of what the best tactics will be that also keep people safe. And so I don't even want to suggest something that might not be, that might unintentionally endanger someone, because it's really serious stuff. When we're looking at really the immoral treatment of immigrants in this nation right now.
Yeah, I was wondering how many of us, are there in the United States, and are we growing
In terms of population,
in terms of the League of Women Voters?
I don't have exact membership numbers, but I can tell you is we are definitely growing. And I don't have the latest number. What I can tell you is, and I know some of you had some heartburn over the launch of the new membership system. And I feel your pain. I get it. Remember, I came from a local league. And a local league leader, I did pretty much every job you could do at a local league. But here's what we know. Since launching that system, and this number is about a month and a half old. We gained over 10,000 members through the system. And now we have not launched a national membership campaign yet. That's without launching a national membership campaign, and that rate of growth is not typical for us. So we're growing much faster than we were before. Now, that's due to two things. I mean, there's correlation and causation. I can't prove causation. But certainly the political climate, people looking for an outlet, someplace where they can get active, or some organization that they want to support, but also making it easier to join. So we, in fact, are growing. We know that almost all of our leagues, national and local and state leagues, have gained new members in the last few months. So yeah, we're growing, and it is exciting. I think there are a number of reasons. So if you're a league member and you're a league leader, you're getting these new members, fold them in, find out what they're interested in. Many of them are joining because they want to do something. They're looking for an organization where they can do something. And, we're one of the very few truly national grassroots organizations, truly, right? When you join, and this is why I got involved in the league. I joined my local League of Women Voters because, I'm willing to stuff envelopes. Sometimes you got to do that. But I also want a seat at the decision-making table. And when you join your local league, all you have to do is sign up for a committee, right? And suddenly you have a seat at the decision-making table on strategy and tactics for whatever it is that you're working on. And that's what the league often offers people that other organizations can't. And that's not to say that other organizations aren't doing great work, they're just doing it differently than we do. Other questions?
Yeah, I got one, you talked earlier about reaching out to a lot more people. And it's, how do we in the league, we're not a huge organization, you know, locally or something. How do we expand out and reach all these different people, you know, and is there good ways of doing it?
Yeah,
Or what?
you
Are we
want
looking
like
for
the
good ideas?
answer, the magic answer, it does it, and if any one of us had that, we'd share it with everyone. I think that it is multiple tactics, right? It's multiple tactics, and it's using, and leveraging the latest, technology and platforms. You know, making sure that we're doing that effectively. And, you know, different audiences need different, you reach them differently. And so, you know, your newsletters are gonna be great for some audiences. And other audiences aren't going to read a newsletter, but they are gonna look at an Instagram post or a Facebook post or Blue Sky. It just depends on your audience. So you need to have a presence on all of those platforms. You need to have a good website. So once people find you one place and they want to check you out, they can really learn about you. And you need to be physically present in the community. You know, so it's all of that together, and no one thing or one event is probably going to do it. So that doesn't give you your answer, because I know you're all working on all of that. So you're doing the work, but I think it's paying off. We're growing. We are growing.
So the league is built on all these courageous women. What does courage look like for us today? Supporting disenfranchised groups, and, you know, I've been thinking a lot about, like, if I was in the community and encounter a difficult circumstance that is not right, I wanna be ready. I wanna think about how I'm gonna behave. I don't need to be like crazy person, but I wanna stand up and stand for people that can't stand for themselves. To me, the history of the League of Women Voters is that, but I am struggling with, what does it look like for women today in the culture that we're in?
It's a big question. And probably all of us in this room would have a different answer. And I do think it's a very personal question, because what each of us need to do is recognize the moment we're in. And we have lessons from history, right? We have lessons from our American history, and we have lessons from international history about what happens when people stand by silently. And it's really easy to judge that, you know, in hindsight, but now we're in it. And I think each of us needs to ask ourselves, what are we willing and able to do? And I can't answer that for any given individual, because your levels of risk may be different than mine. And I'm gonna share a personal example. And the kind of thinking that I had to go through in terms of risk, and this was about 10 years ago. So I got arrested. So when you presented my bio, you know, it's never in my bio, because you never know how that's gonna land. But some groups, I think I ought to lead with that, because that's I got arrested in North Carolina. It was part of what was called the Moral Monday movement, led by Reverend, now Bishop Barber, who now leads the Poor People's Campaign. And this was something that was happening every single Monday that summer. It started with a dozen people who refused to leave a legislator's office because they weren't getting answers. And they hadn't planned on being arrested. They got arrested. Well, the next week, more people came. And more people got arrested. The next week, more people came. And then it became big rallies and protests on what is this grassy mall outside the legislature. And so people were showing up every Monday by the thousands. So it started with a dozen people, came by the thousands. So what does that mean? For 12 people with the courage to do that. But then the next week, there were a few more. He said, this is wrong, and they were gonna add to those numbers until it grew and grew and grew. And, you know, on some level, there is safety in numbers. All right, so remember that, it can start small, but for those of you who are able, you can be part of a growing movement. And then I got really angry because on a holiday week, when nothing was supposed to happen, and the lobbyists had it was 4th of July week. Lobbyists had left town. The Dems had left town, the legislators. And the Republican leadership, after the news cycle that evening, went into session. And they took a motorcycle safety bill, gutted it, and put in reproductive health restrictions. By the way, became known as the motorcycle vagina bill. I was so angry. I was so angry, and I'm not gonna tell you everything I did that night and that day. But leading up to Monday, you know, on Monday morning, I told my husband, I think I'm gonna get arrested today. And he was very supportive, you know, went to the bank, withdrew cash in case he had to like bond me out in cash. And I got arrested. And I got arrested protesting that particular legislation, as well as the process. So whether you are pro-choice or not, I felt like everybody should be outraged at the process itself. That's not the way that law should be made. Well, leading up to it, I had to make some big decisions. So I, at that time, was a professor at a community college in a rural community. I lived in Raleigh, but commuted out to this rural community. I thought, I could lose my job. I could lose my job. They might not release me from jail. Now, they had been arresting people every Monday, and they've been releasing most of them, but you never know. You never know. This could cost me money, right? I may lose friends over this, because, you know, abortion rights, that can be difficult for some people. I might have some relatives angry at me because of the issue. You know, those are all risks I had to take, and I was going to have an arrest on my record. But by the time, you know, I think I was 50. And I thought, well, college fires me over this. At this point in my life, this has not always been the case. I have the means to hire an attorney. And at 50, I'm not as concerned about building my professional credibility and being able to get a job later. The work I do doesn't require a certain kind of license. So do you understand how my risk, very different than someone else's risk? And I will tell you, I'm very conscious and will always say it. I did that out of a place of privilege. So what I would ask you is, if you are sitting in this room and if you have a certain level of privilege, you know, what are you willing to risk? Are you willing to risk some of that privilege in order to leverage it in service of democracy and in defense of other people's human rights? So and I'm not saying everyone in this room should make the decision I made, because those are very real consequences. And I've often told young people that don't necessarily go out and get arrested. Don't glorify this, because this could affect you in some different ways that you don't expect a decade later, right? So, you know, just evaluate where you are in life and what you're willing to risk and understand, we're all gonna have to risk something. We're all going to have to make some sacrifices.
And on that note, that's on your bucket list. Diana, thank you so much. This has just been absolutely wonderful. I'm sure everybody here. So I also from the Women's Equality Coalition, I want to thank both the Johnson County League and the Kansas City League. Let me see, Jackson, Clay, and Platte County. I thank everybody who helped during this getting this presentation together. So thank you so much.